Major Denis Mahon of Strokestown Park stands today as one of the most contentious figures of the Great Irish Famine. In the long gallery of 19th century Irish landlords, some were negligent, others merely incompetent, and a few were outright cruel. Mahon occupies an uneasy middle ground, a man trapped by inherited debts and a collapsing estate, yet willing, perhaps too willing, to embrace measures that placed thousands of impoverished tenants in mortal danger. His story is not one of cartoon villainy, but of a landlord who allowed estate finances to override human survival. In the worst year of the famine, that failure had fatal consequences, both for his tenants and ultimately for himself. At the time Mahon assumed control of the Strokestown estate, his family's financial position was already precarious. The estate carried large debts, typically estimated around £30,000, a crushing burden for any landed property in the west of Ireland, particularly one weighed down by a dense tenantry and marginal land. Well before the famine, relations between Mahon and his tenants were already strained. The estate's management style was firm, often inflexible, and rarely responsive to the chronic poverty of the district. Many tenants complained that rents were out of step with local conditions and increasingly difficult to meet. There was a growing perception that the landlord class at Strokestown prioritised estate accounts over the welfare of the families who worked the land. These tensions reached a dramatic point in the mid-1830s when tenants began a rent strike, openly refusing to pay what they considered excessive or unjust demands. The protest quickly spread through neighbouring townlands, reflecting not only economic hardship, but also a deepening mistrust of Mahon's intentions. Rather than seeking compromise, reducing arrears, or adjusting demands to the reality of rural poverty, Mahon reinforced the adversarial tone. He issued eviction notices, pursued legal actions, and adopted a posture that left little room for negotiation. Even before the potato blight arrived, landlord and tenantry were already locked in a relationship that was deeply antagonistic. Thus, when the famine struck in 1845, it did not hit a community with any real sense of mutual trust. Instead, it struck a district where the tenants viewed Mahon as a landlord who saw them primarily as financial units, and where Mahon saw tenants who challenged his authority and threatened his already fragile solvency. Neither side believed the other capable of fairness, an atmosphere that shaped every action that followed. Yet even this troubled relationship does not excuse what came next. As the potato crop collapsed for successive years and hunger swept across Roscommon, Mahon's estate finances deteriorated sharply. The dense tenant population could no longer pay rent. Arrears mounted. This was the moment for leadership, for flexibility, for recognition of human catastrophe. But Mahon responded with a cold, economistic logic. He viewed the mass of destitute tenants as a burden to be reduced. What he called assisted emigration became the estate's primary solution. In reality, it was a clearance scheme executed during a humanitarian disaster. In April 1847, he began removing entire families, some willingly, many desperately, and others under immense pressure, from their holdings and arranging for their passage to Canada. Roughly 1,490 people were marched from Strokestown to Dublin along the Royal Canal, a journey now memorialised as the National Famine Way. From Dublin they were sent to Liverpool and loaded onto vessels bound for Quebec. These were not rescue ships. They were overcrowded, under-provisioned transports whose conditions were notorious even in their own time. The ships used, most famously the Virginius, became emblematic of the coffin ship phenomenon. By the time the Virginius reached Quebec, about one-third of its passengers had died. Others died on the Naomi, the Erin's Queen, and the John Munn. Survivors spilled into the fever sheds of Quebec City, where disease finished what the Atlantic crossing had begun. Mortality rates among man's-assisted emigrants were shocking even by the grim standards of 1847. Supporters of Mahon have occasionally argued that emigration offered tenants a chance unavailable at home, or that he was simply overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. But these arguments duck the central issue. Mahon chose the cheapest solution. He could have reduced rents or suspended arrears. He could have invested in better relief or pressed creditors for long-term restructuring. He could have followed the example of more responsible landlords who used their remaining resources to sustain their tenants. Instead, he prioritized solvency. The suffering of the poor became a line item in the estate's account book. This hard-edged approach deepened local anger. Reports circulated that Mahon had personally overseen evictions, that he permitted cabins to be demolished, and that he refused to consider real rent reductions. Whether every allegation was true is less important than the fact that the people of Roscommon wholeheartedly believed them. Mahon was seen as a man using the catastrophe to cleanse his lands. On November 2nd, 1847, the resentment that had simmered for years finally erupted. As Mahon travelled by carriage near the village of Scramog, he was ambushed and shot dead. He became the first Irish landlord murdered during the famine, and the killing sent shockwaves through Ireland and Britain. To the Anglo-Irish elite, the assassination confirmed their worst fears about agrarian violence. For the starving poor, it marked the moment when patience and survival finally gave way. The authorities' response was immediate and severe. Several local men were arrested. Patrick Hasty was convicted and hanged for the murder, and others were prosecuted for related conspiracies. The Crown sought to implicate not just individuals but an entire culture of resistance. Clergy and repeal activists were questioned aggressively. The state's aim was as much to reassert authority as to secure justice. Yet the assassination also revealed the exhaustion of the old landlord system. It underscored how hollow landlord authority had become in districts where the populace was starving and the estate's decisions were seen as life-threatening. Within a decade, the encumbered estates court began breaking up bankrupt properties. By the end of the century, successive land acts had dismantled the landlord system almost entirely. Today, Denis Mahon's name is bound inextricably to the wider tragedy of Strokestown. His former estate house now contains the National Famine Museum, where letters, eviction notices, and ledgers document those bleak years. These records reveal a landlord who chose calculation over compassion, a man whose estate difficulties were real, but whose decisions deepened the suffering of thousands. His murder was unlawful, but the anger that produced it was rooted in real misery. On the Strokestown estate, countless lives were reshaped, many destroyed by decisions made in the name of solvency. In the moral landscape of the Great Famine, Denis Mahon remains a stark example of the human cost when economic logic eclipses human duty. If you found this story interesting, please give the video a like. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more Irish history brought to life every week.